The wind howls across the plains. Snow folds over the forests like a blanket of glass. In the far north, even breath turns to frost before it leaves your lips. To most, this is the season of retreat, a time to hide, to endure, to wait. But for the native peoples who called these frozen landscapes home, winter was not an enemy. It was a test they had already mastered. While others saw scarcity, they saw rhythm. Every sound, every shadow in the snow held information. Ice cracking across a river warned of shifting fish runs. A pattern of frost on trees revealed where the wind would settle coldest. Survival here wasn't about fire or shelter alone. It was a complete system, a choreography of skill, timing, and understanding. Across the Great Plains, buffalo hides were layered to create windproof garments so efficient that modern cold-weather gear still struggles to match them. In the northern woodlands, smoked meat, frozen berries, and cured fish filled storage caches months in advance, turning snow season into a time of security rather than fear. And in the Arctic, families built entire networks of snow shelters that breathed, ventilated, and insulated, all sculpted from the very element that defined their world. This wasn't about endurance, it was about mastery. An intelligence carved from centuries of watching and learning. They didn't just survive winter, they shaped it. And today, their methods still challenge everything we think we know about resilience, preparation, and community. Because every day, we bring history back to life, revealing how ancient design and knowledge built a blueprint for survival that still outperforms the modern world. Subscribe now and discover how the coldest season once became the proving ground of human brilliance. When most people imagine surviving winter, the first thoughts are simple. Build a fire, find shelter, wait for spring. But for the native peoples of the plains, woodlands, and Arctic, that mindset would never have been enough. They didn't wait for winter to pass. They prepared to live through it, move through it, and even prosper in it. To them, survival began months before the first snow ever fell. Preparation was not a task, it was a season of its own. Every step, harvesting, curing, sowing, fortifying, was part of a rhythm that turned anticipation into readiness. Families collected wood early, not in piles, but in layers, knowing the difference between fast-burning pine for kindling and slow-burning hardwood for steady heat. Food was dried, smoked, and stored in elevated caches to outlast hunger and keep out moisture. Animal fats were rendered and sealed for cooking, fuel, and weatherproofing. Shelter, too, went beyond a structure. In the northern woodlands, the framework of a winter lodge was lined with bark and moss to seal against wind, while furs hung along the inner walls to trap heat. On the open plains, families reinforced lodges with extra poles and hides thickened by frost, turning mobile homes into sturdy strongholds. Farther north, in frozen tundra, blocks of snow themselves became architecture, cut, stacked, and curved with precision that required no nails, no timber, just understanding. This was not basic survival. It was a complete system, grounded in foresight, community, and adaptation. They didn't react to winter. They built for it. And when the storms arrived, they were already ready, sitting in warmth, their stores full, their shelters silent under the weight of snow. In a world obsessed with comfort, they remind us that mastery begins not in luxury, but in preparation. Winter was never a season of emptiness. It was a test of memory and preparation. By the time the first frost settled, native families had already turned the land into a living pantry. Every nut, root, and strip of meat stored away was the result of months of careful gathering and foresight. What looked like barren wilderness to outsiders was, to them, a carefully mapped network of resources waiting to be used. In the Great Plains, hunters followed the movements of buffalo herds long before the snow came. Nothing was left to chance. Meat was sliced thin and dried over slow smoke, preserving it for months without spoilage. When mixed with rendered fat and crushed berries, It became a dense food that could outlast the coldest blizzard and fuel journeys for weeks. Every tribe had its version of this endurance food: compact, reliable, and astonishingly efficient. In the northern woodlands, families built caches high in trees, beyond the reach of wolves and melting snow. Fish caught in the fall were split, smoked, and sealed in bark wrappings. Berries were boiled into thick syrups, preserving their flavor and nutrients through deep winter. Even tree bark and intercambium layers were known sources of sustenance when the forest fell silent. Farther north, in the Arctic and subarctic, ingenuity reached its peak. Hunters cut precise openings in the ice to trap fish, storing their catch frozen in the snow itself, nature's cold storage. Seal oil served as both food and heat source, burning cleanly in stone lamps that glowed through the long polar nights. To survive winter was to think ahead. To thrive in it was to understand the land so deeply that scarcity became an illusion. Every harvest, every cache, every preparation was a quiet declaration. We know this season, and it knows us. Cold was never an opponent, it was a problem to solve. And native ingenuity met it with engineering so refined that even today, outdoor gear designers echo their methods. The ability to stay warm while moving through deep snow or cutting wind was not a luxury. It was survival science at its finest. In the Great Plains, buffalo hides became both armor and insulation. The outer layer, tanned with smoke and fat, repelled moisture and blocked wind, while the inner fur trapped heat close to the body. Hunters wrapped themselves in layered garments designed to breathe yet protect, long before anyone coined the phrase thermal regulation. Snow and sleet slid off the surface rather than soaking through, allowing movement in conditions that froze leather stiff. In the northern woodlands, layers of deerskin and woven plant fibers created a natural insulation system. Moccasins were lined with dried grass or rabbit fur, creating warmth without stiffness. Sinew thread stitching kept water from seeping through, and ash soot rubbed into seams acted as a natural sealant. Clothing wasn't only functional, it was calculated. The cut of every sleeve, the curve of every seam, was shaped by trial and experience. Farther north, in the Arctic, design reached perfection. Caribou hides, hollow-haired and incredibly light, formed parkas that balanced breathability with insulation better than modern synthetics. Footwear crafted from sealskin stayed flexible in freezing temperatures, and layered mittens created microclimates for the hands. Even snowshoes were marvels of physics, distributing weight so precisely that travelers could walk across drifts without sinking. These weren't crude improvisations. They were the product of observation, patience, and material knowledge so deep that every item served multiple functions. When settlers struggled with frostbite, native hunters crossed miles of tundra unscathed. They didn't just dress for survival, they engineered it. Winter survival was never an individual pursuit. It was a communal craft, a living library built not from books, but from people. Every technique, from building snow traps to tanning hides, lived inside the minds and hands of those who practiced it. Knowledge was protection, and sharing it was an act of preservation that stretched across generations. In villages of the northern woodlands, long nights became classrooms. Elders told stories not only to entertain, but to teach. Around the fire, a tale about a lost hunter was really a lesson in navigation. A myth about a frozen river taught when and where ice could bear weight. Each story carried instructions disguised as memory, repeated until the lesson became instinct. Apprenticeship was woven into daily life. Young hunters learned how to read tracks, gauge snow depth, and sense storms before they came. Women passed down the art of crafting clothing that balanced warmth and flexibility, teaching through repetition and correction rather than explanation. Children grew up inside a web of shared survival, a system where no one mastered everything, but everyone knew enough to keep the community alive. In the Great Plains, cooperation turned into coordination. Buffalo hunts were collective operations, requiring timing, patience, and mutual trust. Every person, from scout to hide scraper, played a role. One mistake could cost a season's worth of food, and so efficiency became a kind of moral code. Farther north, Inuit families treated the winter as a test of unity. When storms trapped them indoors for days, time was filled with tool repair, song, and instruction. Isolation never meant idleness. It meant refinement. This communal approach transformed survival from a skill into a culture. The cold was never conquered alone. It was met together through a shared language of practice and purpose that kept knowledge alive as surely as it kept people warm. When snow sealed the world in silence, life continued beneath the surface, in cellars, pits, and caches where food lasted months beyond its harvest. Native Americans didn't just store provisions. They engineered systems of preservation so effective that entire communities could depend on them through the longest, darkest stretches of winter. In the northern woodlands, food storage began underground. Shallow pits were lined with bark, clay, and cedar boughs to regulate moisture. Above them, a covering of moss and soil created a natural refrigeration chamber, cool enough to prevent spoilage, yet insulated from freezing solid. Inside lay smoked venison, cornmeal, nuts, and dried berries, each carefully sealed in woven baskets. These caches were placed near homes but out of reach of animals, often disguised under leaves or snow. On the Great Plains, hunters used the cold itself as a tool. Fresh meat was cut into long strips and dried over slow-burning fires, the smoke acting as both preservative and deterrent to insects. Rendered fat sealed it completely, forming dense provisions that could be eaten months later with no loss of nutrition. Seeds and grains were stored in hide sacks suspended from lodge poles, protected from moisture and rodents alike. In the Arctic, survival demanded even greater ingenuity. Fish and seal meat were packed in snow trenches that froze solid, turning permafrost into a deep freeze long before modern refrigeration existed. Oil rendered from whale or seal served not just as a source of light and heat, it was also mixed with lean meat and stored as a high-energy food for travel. Each method reflected generations of refinement, an understanding of chemistry without formulas, of temperature control without instruments. What kept them alive wasn't luck. It was engineering born from attention. They turned perishables into permanence, using only the elements that surrounded them. Winter tested more than the body. It tested focus, patience, and endurance. Long before psychologists studied resilience, Native communities had already mastered the mental discipline required to face months of cold and scarcity without despair. Their survival began not with tools or supplies, but with mindset. The season was never seen as punishment. It was a cycle, a time to rest, reflect, repair, and prepare. In the northern woodlands, when deep snow locked villages in place, people turned inward. They repaired clothing, recarved tools, retold histories. The rhythm of daily work continued, but with a quieter pulse. Boredom was rare because every action had purpose. In the Great Plains, hunters faced isolation head-on. When storms pinned them inside lodges, they used the confinement to sharpen weapons, reinforce sled frames, or plan upcoming hunts. Preparation itself became routine, an act that replaced anxiety with control. The key to endurance was predictability, knowing what came next, even when the wind erased all sound outside. Farther north, in Arctic communities, mental strength was communal. Families shared stories and songs that stretched through the dark, not as distraction, but as cohesion. Every voice, every rhythm, kept minds anchored when days disappeared into endless night. This togetherness wasn't luxury. It was psychological design, ensuring that no one faced the monotony or fear alone. They understood that winter's greatest danger wasn't hunger, it was hopelessness. So they built resilience not just through work, but through structure and belonging. The human spirit didn't need to fight the cold. It needed to stay focused within it. Their endurance came from rhythm, repetition, and connection. The same elements that sustained their fires and preserved their food. In a world where stillness could feel like defeat, they turned it into a form of strength. When the world outside froze solid and daylight faded to a brief blue haze, warmth and light became the difference between life and loss. Native engineers met that challenge not with abundance, but with precision. Every spark, every flicker of flame was the result of design. Planned, controlled, and sustained for months without waste. In the northern woodlands, warmth began at the floor. Layers of pine needles, moss, and woven mats created insulation that trapped heat rising from the hearth. Stones heated in the fire were rolled to the sides of the lodge, releasing slow warmth long after the flames dimmed. Families rotated their places around the fire so no one slept in the chill for long. Even smoke served a function. Its path mapped through carefully placed vents that pulled fresh air in and carried exhaust away without drafts. Across the Great Plains, buffalo fat became one of the most effective fuels in the ancient world. When melted, it burned with steady brightness and little smoke, used in shallow lamps carved from bone or stone. A single flame could light an entire lodge, and its warmth radiated softly through hide coverings. It wasn't waste, it was calculation. Every flame worked as hard as the hands that struck it. In the Arctic, innovation reached new extremes. Seal oil, rendered with meticulous care, filled carved lamps that burned for hours on a single wick of dried moss or twisted plant fiber. These lamps didn't merely light the space, they heated it, dried clothing, and melted snow for water. Families could read, cook, and work in near silence, the faint hiss of oil the only sound breaking the endless dark. To modernize, these methods might seem primitive, but step inside one of those shelters and you'd feel what technology still struggles to deliver: steady warmth, soft light, and the comfort of precision born from necessity. Winter didn't trap these communities. It transformed how they moved. While most people think of the cold as confinement, native ingenuity turned ice and snow into pathways. Travel, hunting, and trade didn't stop when the rivers froze. They simply shifted forms, guided by tools and techniques perfectly adapted to each landscape. On the Great Plains, frozen ground became an advantage. Hunters used it to travel vast distances quickly, following herds that moved along windswept ridges where the snow stayed shallow. Sleds, pulled by dogs or hand-dragged across ice, replaced heavy wagons. Lightweight poles, lashed together, created frames strong enough to haul meat or firewood while gliding effortlessly across packed snow. In the northern woodlands, where snow fell thick and deep, mobility required invention. Snowshoes were the key, frames bent from ash or birch and webbed with rawhide strips. Each design matched the environment. Long, narrow shapes for open country, wide, round patterns for dense forest. They distributed weight so precisely that a person could walk across fresh powder while leaving only the faintest mark. Hunters moved quietly, swiftly, unseen. Farther north, the Arctic tribes took movement to an art form. They engineered sleds, kamutiks, that could glide over snowdrifts or frozen seas without breaking. Every joint was lashed, not nailed, so the structure flexed with the terrain instead of cracking. Seal skins wrapped around runners reduced friction, and dogs worked in perfect formation, guided by voice alone. Mobility wasn't a luxury, it was strategy. These designs turned frozen landscapes into networks of travel and trade, linking distant villages that might otherwise have remained isolated until spring. To outsiders, it seemed miraculous that anyone could thrive in such conditions. To the people who lived it, it was simply good design. proof that motion itself could be engineered from snow, wood, and instinct. When snow blanketed the land and travel slowed, winter became more than a time of survival. It was a time of restoration. The frozen months were when communities looked inward, repairing not only tools and shelters, but also the connections that bound them together. To outsiders, it might have seemed like inactivity. In truth, it was the season of preparation that determined how strong the coming year would be. Inside lodges and earth-covered homes, the rhythm of repair began. Bows were restrung, arrows refeathered, snowshoes mended with fresh sinew. Hides stretched by firelight became new clothing and coverings. Children watched and learned through imitation, shaping their first small tools beside the hands of their parents. The fire's glow was both light and lesson, its steadiness a reflection of the quiet persistence that defined the season. On the Great Plains, women reinforced lodge covers with newly tanned hides and replaced worn stitching with gut fibers that swelled tight in damp weather. In the northern woodlands, canoes stored for the winter were inspected plank by plank, ensuring that when spring melt came, no seam would fail. Farther north, Arctic families tended to sled runners, scraping and polishing them smooth again for the next migration. Winter wasn't an interruption. It was the workshop of the year. When the land slept, the people worked in silence, refining what the past seasons had taught them. This was the time for recalibration, for sharpening what had dulled, for strengthening what had weakened. They didn't wait idly for warmth to return. They used the cold as a pause to rebuild. The season that most feared became their foundation, the period when skill, patience, and discipline were quietly renewed, one steady hand at a time. In an age of central heating, insulated walls, and endless convenience, it's easy to believe we've conquered winter. But the truth is, we've only hidden from it. The native peoples of the plains, the woodlands, and the Arctic didn't hide. They met the season on equal terms, answering its cold logic with clarity, skill, and community. And that's the part the modern world still hasn't learned. Their survival systems weren't based on excess. They were based on rhythm. They stored food not in panic, but in patience. They designed clothing to balance heat and breath, not to trap one and waste the other. They treated the fire not as decoration, but as a precise instrument of survival. Every task, every material, every habit was chosen through observation, not guesswork. But perhaps their most relevant lesson wasn't about engineering at all. It was about attitude. They didn't see winter as a disaster to avoid. They saw it as part of life's pattern. Preparation, cooperation, and focus turned what others called hardship into opportunity. When power fails, when storms cut supply lines, when comfort gives way to necessity, those same lessons return. The knowledge that foresight beats fear, that efficiency comes from respect for the environment, not dominance over it, that survival begins long before the first snow. Their way of life reminds us that true progress isn't the ability to control nature. It's the ability to live with awareness inside it. Long before technology, they created systems that could endure any season. And in a time when modern infrastructure falters under a single storm, their design still stands as the most advanced blueprint of all. What they built wasn't primitive. It was perfect for its world. And in that perfection lies the quiet truth we keep rediscovering. Resilience begins with understanding. When the snow fell hardest and the winds screamed through the trees, native families sat inside their shelters, calm and ready. Food was stocked. Fires burned low and steady. Tools hung in perfect order along the walls. They had done their work long before the first frost, and now, when the world seemed frozen, they lived in peace. Their survival wasn't luck, it was discipline, refined over generations. Today, when a power outage can paralyze entire cities, their example feels less like history and more like prophecy. They built systems that never failed because they required no external support, no engines, no grids, no excess. Their strength came from timing, cooperation, and the understanding that preparation is freedom. The lessons they left behind are still waiting for us. They show that endurance isn't about isolation, it's about connection. They remind us that comfort isn't built on abundance, but on awareness. That real progress doesn't come from replacing the old, it comes from remembering what worked. The next time the cold closes in, think of the people who treated winter not as a punishment, but as proof of readiness. They didn't wait for mercy, they built it. Because every generation faces its own kind of winter. Ours may not come with snow, but it still demands foresight, patience, and unity. The ancient builders of the plains, the woodlands, and the Arctic already wrote the guide. We just have to follow it. If this story changed how you see survival, join us again. Every day, we uncover the systems, designs, and ideas that once defined human endurance, and could again. Subscribe now, and be part of the journey as we bring history back to life, one forgotten survival secret at a time.